Good evening and welcome. I think we're ready to get going. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. My job is to promote biography, hand out fabulous fellowships, and I get to interview wonderful writers like Paul Hendrickson on stage to get to talk about their new work. Our next event is going to be March 13th with Vivian Gornick, a fabulous writer and memoirist, being interviewed by Philip Lopate. I first began reading Paul Hendrickson's byline in the style section of the Washington Post back in the 1980s. His feature stories were always compelling. He wrote with a certain passion and a very distinctive personal voice. I really became a fan, though, in 1987 when I read an essay in the Washington Post magazine with this long title. On September 29, 1972, a young unknown artist tried to throw Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, off Martha's Vineyard's ferry. This is why. That was the whole title of the newspaper story. And then Hendrickson went on to explain what had happened. He was then trying to write a biography of Robert McNamara. And at the time, I was about 6 years only into researching a biography of John McCloy, the so-called chairman of the foreign policy establishment, and a friend of McNamara's. Both men had been deeply involved in managing the Vietnam War. Anyway, Paul Hendrickson's story about how McNamara almost lost his life on the ferry was absolutely mesmerizing. He described tracking down the assailant and how he managed to get him to talk about that dark night on the ferry. He got the artist to confess. And then he wrote, "That evening, I rode back to the mainland, thinking I had just rubbed the Rosetta Stone of all the imploded anger of the 1960s. Hendrickson is one of those rare writers who knows how to peel back the painful scabs in our history. He really is an exceptional writer. He's the author now of 7 books, and as a biographer, he has written about McNamara, but also Ernest Hemingway, and now Frank Lloyd Wright. So I am delighted to welcome Paul here tonight. He and I will chat for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And afterwards, he will be signing books, his new book, Plagued by Fire, The Dreams and Furies of Frank Lloyd Wright, sold in the lobby in the back there by Books on Call of New York City. Paul, welcome.
Thank you, thank you. I wonder if I could seize the microphone for just a minute and bat the ball back across the net. That was an eloquent and gracious introduction. But the truth is, I have been following Kai for as long as he said he's been reading me, if not longer. And until tonight, we had not physically met, but we sort of remotely and distantly knew each other through Washington journalism. I think some of you in this audience must certainly know his magisterial book about Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, American Prometheus, published in 2005, which won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award in the same year. I'm often a bridesmaid. I get a finalist for these awards. He wins them. That book, to me, is a beacon of what a biography should be, and it's not the kind of biography I'm capable of writing. So I feel humbled to be on this stage with him.
You're too modest.
Thank you. Thank you.
Paul, we're here to talk about you and celebrate you and this new book. But I thought I'd begin with a little of your personal background. And I know your first book was about your early years in an Alabama seminary, studying to become a priest. So I want to know how that education helped to prepare you to become a writer and specifically a biographer.
What a great question. I said somewhere once that I feel on my best days as a writer, I'm being priestly with a small p. I'm not even sure I'm much. I think I'm more spiritual now, but I'm certainly not religious, and I'm kind of a sailor without a sea, which is to say, I don't have a church. But here is the story. For 7 years, in my wayward youth, from age 14 to 21, I was a student for the Catholic priesthood. This is what 1950s boys did. The supposed best and brightest boys, urged on by their Irish Catholic mothers and the nuns who said the best thing you could possibly ever do was just get on that raft and ride right into the seminary. So I was kind of hermetically sealed away for 7 years studying to be a priest. And on the day in the summer of 1965, 6 weeks before taking vows, which would have not made me a priest, but would have been binding and only released by going to Rome, I decided to leave that life. I was 21 years old. I was a virgin. I was scared stiff. I had never been on a date, much less kissed a woman. Most of my cultural heroes had saint affixed to their first name. So here I was coming out in the middle of the Vietnam War. In the summer of 1965, matriculated into university, didn't have many credits to finish. And I think what saved me is that somehow I knew I was going to write. So many of my seminary buddies fell by the wayside because after that intense, parboiled seminary experience, almost nothing else could live up to it. But I got vectored right away toward writing, and one thing led to another, and I got into journalism after graduate school and on with the books. But I do feel that on my best days as a writer, without trying to be more highfalutin than this deserves, I do feel that I am trying to be a tiny bit priestly in the best sense of the word.
I quite agree. I mean, all your books are trying to get at the morality behind the story, I think. No?
Yeah, you know, this, Kai and I have had some wonderful emails leading up to this, and I said to him at one point, yes, Kai, I am the man who writes non-biography biographies. I can't seem to write a conventional biography from cradle to grave, as Kai magisterially did in the book that I mentioned. I try to find storytelling pockets in a life and yet take the journey on an arc from east to west, meaning when the subject arrives in the world and when he peters out. But I can't seem to do what Kai does so beautifully, which is to give us the whole full life in every phase. I find these storytelling pockets. Speaking of seminary, we should get off seminary, shouldn't we? But there was a Latin figure of speech that I do remember called synecdoche, part for the whole. And I guess what I'm trying to do is find the part for the whole. But to answer the question more directly, Kai, yes. Again, wary of sounding grandiose, but trying to get at the fundamental moral aspect of character. And it's so difficult. When I learn how to do it, I'll be the first to tell you.
Well, you do it very well, and it's a singular voice. But you're now teaching in an academic setting. But you came out of, all your books and all your journalism came out of the journalistic tradition. And you say in your afterword in this book, I come proudly from a journalistic tradition. And, you know, this raises an interesting issue about biography. There are biographers who come from the academic tradition and some from the journalistic. And there's, is there a difference? Is there a competition? What can they learn from each other, the two traditions?
I think you and I, even though we do quite different kinds of biographies, we are yoked there and elsewhere in that there is a journalistic aspect of this. I do come proudly from a journalistic tradition. I wonder if I can give an example. There would be plenty of examples in this book about Frank Lloyd Wright, but the one that instantly leaped to mind is my previous book. They all seem to take 7 years. I don't know how. I have a wonderful...
That's short.
Biographer friend. Yes, that's short. I know that American Prometheus had a long history, and it's a co-authored book. But I have a friend, David Marinus. He writes them in 3 years, and you know, they're beautifully done. I sometimes feel I'm working with a hammer and chisel. But on the journalism aspect, I seem to need to be grounded in the fact, and to go out and search, and to talk to people, living people who somehow had a connection with whom I'm writing about. So I just said, if I can quickly call an example from my previous book, which was about Ernest Hemingway. It's called Hemingway's Boat, Everything He Loved in Life and Lost. It's not about Hemingway's boat, except it is. That's the prism or the storytelling meta kind of figurative metaphor through which I tried to tell his life. There's a lot of luck in what we do. So I teach at the University of Pennsylvania, talking about the academic part, but I teach writing, advanced writing workshops, and believe me, I'm on the edge of the whole academic aspect. I don't have to go to committee meetings. I do my writing workshops with the students, and then I sort of disappear. I have a beautiful office in the English department, and they've let me stay around. I don't have a PhD. My PhD is in the streets of journalism. I have a lowly master's degree. The previous book, my editor, Jonathan Siegel, of 40 years at CUNY, he's not here tonight. He calls me the king of the tangents. You are already discovering why. But I do have a point, and it is about Hemingway's boat and journalism and needing. I got electrified one day. So at the University of Pennsylvania Central Library, which is one of the great university libraries of the world, they didn't have a particular journal I was looking for that had to do with an aspect of Hemingway and Hemingway's boat, in fact. I found that lowly, quote, lowly Temple University had it. So I scurried up to Temple, up North Broad, a couple of miles from the lush confines of the Ivy League University of Pennsylvania, and the phenomenon of luck based on desire. You almost will something into happening because you need it to happen. So I promise, old seminarian, honest engine, put my hand on the Bible, this is what happened. I pulled the wrong volume down from this series of North Dakota Quarterly. That's what it was. And it was the one next to it I was supposed to be getting. But the one I did pull down, I looked in the table of contents, and there was a 10-page memoir of a guy in the Foreign Service named Walter Hauck, who actually knew Ernest Hemingway. And my heart started beating, and I said, would Walter Hauck be alive? Would he be alive? I mean, that day I found out he was in Woodland Hills, California. He was very aged. I didn't get up my nerve to call him that day. I called him the next day. And I blubbered out that, do you think I could come out to see you? He said, would you want to come this far? Believe me, I didn't quite get on the next plane. But all the academics I work with, all praise to them. But if they would have pulled that wrong volume off the shelf, seen a small little article in the North Dakota Quarterly about Walter Houck, who knew Ernest Hemingway and went 4 times on his boat. That wouldn't have mattered to them, I don't think. But the journalistic quotient of being able to talk to a man called Walter, so he ends up a 20,000-word chapter in Hemingway's boat.
Small tangent.
Yeah.
So one more question before we get on to Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm just curious, why Marion Post Walcott? Why Mcnamara? Why Hemingway? How did you choose, or did they choose you in some fashion?
Boy, that's beautifully said, because I do also feel, it sounds spooky and mysterious, but I wonder if Kai and Brenda Wineapple, who's here in the audience, who is a world-class historian, biographer, wrote this beautiful book this past year for Random House called The Impeachers. I wonder if she wouldn't agree. I wonder if my own son, John Hendrickson, the next generation senior editor for The Atlantic, who's here in the audience, wouldn't agree. I wonder if some of my writing students who are out there in the audience were supposed to, I haven't been able to hug you yet, but I think you're there. I wonder if this won't make sense to the writing students, because wasn't I always saying this in class? Namely, and answering your question, I don't think we choose our subjects. I think they choose us. I think they loop around and find us. So, Frank Lloyd Wright, Plagued by Fire. Am I an architectural historian? Am I a architectural critic? A lot of reviewers this year would have jumped up and said I absolutely was not. That's one of the major criticisms I sustained in a lot of attacks on this book. Here's how I found Frank Lloyd Wright, though, and why I feel I have my bona fides. I grew up on a street in Kankakee, Illinois, which is a little town 50 miles south of Chicago, where there were 2 Frank Lloyd Wright houses on the same street I lived on. And in 1953, when I was 9 years old, so you're doing the math and figuring out I'm 75. In 1953, as a 9-year-old, under the Christmas tree was a maroon J.C. Higgins 3-speed. And we lived up where the middle-class people lived on South Harrison Street. But 5 blocks down toward the river were these 2 majestic Frank Lloyd Wright houses, one of which is in every authoritative Frank Lloyd Wright book. I'll be there next month for an event. It's called the B. Harley Bradley. It's a 1900 Frank Lloyd Wright. It is a precursor to his Prairie period. It is, oh boy, here comes seminary again. It's a St. John the Baptist house that sort of predicated all the great Prairie period of Frank Lloyd Wright. As a 9-year-old on my J.C. Higgins 3-speed, I'm sailing down South Harrison with my newfound freedom. And out of the corner of my eye, I'm seeing this immense thing. Certainly I saw it before, but now on my bike, I'm seeing it in a new way. This house that looked like it had come down from Mars. It looked like nothing else in that little Midwestern prairie town. But because I'm a very slow learner, it only took 6 decades for it to loop around and find me as a writing project. So, Kai, I think our writing projects find us. I think as a 9-year-old on his J.C. Higgins 3-speed in the spring of 1953, it would have been 1954 because it was under the Christmas tree on December 25th, 1953, something was getting in that infected my imagination, and it was choosing me, only I didn't know about it. It just took a long time to find me.
So, he found you, but you weren't interested in becoming an architect, and that's not what drew you to the book. You were drawn not by the work per se, but by the man, I would guess.
I absolutely was, and a lot of...
To understand, your curiosity was to figure out who was the man behind these buildings. Is that right?
Absolutely, and I have to say, every one of your questions is wanting to open up so many things that I would like to talk about. I mean, yes, all my life I've been kind of an amateur student of architecture, kind of dating from then. I love looking at buildings. I know something about buildings, but I'm, you'll excuse the expression, a half-assed amateur student of architecture. I know what I know and I like what I like, but boy, am I not schooled in any kind of architectural criticism. But that wasn't my compelling interest. It's almost like an associative word test. You say Ernest Hemingway and you can think of great writer, not a great human being. I think that's what a lot of people would say. Ditto Frank Lloyd Wright, maybe times two. We think of him as this arrogant, Napoleonic with his cape and his pork pie hat, sailing through the world with his ego and his arrogance. Somehow from early on, I began to believe there was more there about Frank Lloyd Wright. And I was interested, Kai, in trying, if I could, to understand the humanity of the man, which gets back to kind of your question about the morality of these stories. I mean, we can go.
So,
Yes.
briefly, how long did it take you to write this book?
I think I've been writing it since 1953. But 7 years. Hemingway's book was published in 2011.
And yes, he was arrogant, he was difficult, he's complicated, but in the end, did you like him?
Ken Burns, who did a magnificent 2-hour documentary on Frank Lloyd Wright way back, 1998. At the time he was out beating the drum for that documentary, he said, who would be the man that I might least wish to drive across the country with in a car? It might be Frank Lloyd Wright. Oh, look. Frank Lloyd Wright said some unconscionable things. We're talking about ego. He was the father of 7. He abandoned his first wife and ran off with his client. He was then the father of 6 children, the youngest who was not quite 5. In his autobiography, published in 1932, Frank Lloyd, he spanned the 19th century and the 20th century. I mean, he was born 2 years after the end of the Civil War, and he died not quite 2 years after the launch of Sputnik. 91 years and 10 months on the earth. In his autobiography in 1932, so, he died in 1959. He was fairly up there in years in 1932. His children were grown. Do you know what he said in this autobiography? It's one of the great literate autobiographies of the 20th century, and you must distrust it on every page because of the distortions and the lies and the self-aggrandizement. You can catch him in a lie. And everything. But here, the ego and the arrogance that Kai is referencing, this is very, very hard to get past. Here's what he said in that book. Kai wants to know, did I like him in the end? In this book, he said, among many other things, he said, almost blithely, he said, I've never really had the father feeling for my children. I have had the father feeling for my buildings, especially when I come back to them after a long while. But my children, no. How would that have made his children feel? I mean, that's very hard to get past. This is the same man, nonetheless. So I have a stump speech when I don't do this, which is much more pleasurable when I've gone around the country and talked about this book. See, I feel that that Wright was always looking behind with his regret and with his concealed pain for the very kind of thing that I just quoted. The man that said that also said this. And these things are hiding in the margins, they're ghosting at the edges, and sometimes they're there right out in plain sight. He said, he said this to a patron, one of his most long-suffering patrons. He built houses for this man in Buffalo, D.D. Martin, Dwight D. Martin. He said this in 1908 when he was at the rage of his fame. In my own life, there is much that is complex. It is difficult for me to square my life with myself, and I cannot rest until it is done or I am dead. 3 decades later, in a letter to that man's widow, he said, I only wish I had been less taking and more giving. But character is fate, and mine got me into heavy going and no safe harbor yet in sight. He said in another letter, ugly things happen. I've said the best and the worst of everything came to me. He said in another letter, I have found that when a scheme develops beyond a normal pitch of excellence, the hand of fate wishes to strike it down. The Japanese made a superstition of the circumstance. Purposely, they leave some imperfection somewhere to appease the jealousy of the gods. I neglected the precaution. I'll quote one more. I've met with terrible misfortunes and accidents. There is a good deal of sadness back of all the bravado, and though you may not know it, I too have fought a good fight. So I say, remorse, much less shame, much less secret haunting, these are not ideas we associate with Frank Lloyd Wright. But what if our ideas have been wrong, or at least not wholly correct? And that, I think, was one of the things I was struggling for in this book. I was trying to kind of go to where silences are and say something different. And I heard a journalist say that once. I can't take credit for that.
So, Paul, that brings me right away to the next question I wanted to ask, which is, it seems you're drawn to the sort of imponderables of Frank Lloyd Wright's life, the mysteries. You talk about the never quite knowing. And this confession of the biographer is something I really like. It's a voice that gives me confidence. You're admitting to the reader there are things we cannot know. And that's an interesting voice. You speak to the reader in a personal way, in the first person often. You don't start the biography, at the beginning, he was born on. You mess up the chronology. In fact, you get right into it with one of the mysteries, the imponderables, this horrific mass murder and fire in 1914 when he's already a grown man, a successful architect. And it's a mystery that you keep coming back to throughout the book. It's like...
and people in this audience will know what Kai is referencing, this horrific fire on August 15th, 1914. Wright wasn't home that day, but his home was burned to the ground, and 7 people were murdered, including the woman he had run away with and abandoned his family for. And he literally split her head in half with a shingling hatchet. Of the many things I've been accused of, and I had my say, and the world is having its say about this book, and all power to those people who wish to say. I mean, one early reviewer, which just rocked me back, said that I was being lurid. If I was being lurid for lurid's sake, then all shame on me. What I was trying to do, in fact, was could anyone sustain an event like that and go on to create the Guggenheim wasn't created at the time of this horrific event. If I could speak about that event, but Kai started out this wonderful question, these pregnant questions he keeps asking, with the first person voice, which a lot of people either like or don't like, and confession. Boy, that's a Catholic word. He had to have used it purposely. Of all that I don't know. Could I do two things very quickly? I once saw Gore Vidal in a live appearance like this, and he said in all of his Gore Vidal auteur, he said, any author who reads from his own book is a horse's ass. Could I be a horse's ass and read the last paragraph of this entire book? The last paragraph, because it speaks to what Kai's talking about.
You have our permission.
And it's a short paragraph, but it's literally the last sentence. You don't really even need the context, but I'm standing at Taliesin, his majestic home. There were two Taliesins. There are two Taliesins. The Arizona Taliesin in Scottsdale and the original Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin, which has been built and rebuilt again because of fire. But anyway, this last paragraph. After a while, I said goodbye and got into the shuttle bus that takes tourists down the hill and across the road to the parking lot at the visitor's center. I got into my rental car and drove away northward across the river, certain I would be back, and also thinking to myself, almost saying it out loud, you can never get to the end of the knowing. I wanted to end this book on that note of humility. You can never get to the end of the knowing. Months ago, when I started going out into the world yakking about this book, we had an event at Taliesin in Wisconsin, which is in southwestern Wisconsin, a majestic, majestic home. That's one of the 8 buildings that the UNESCO World Heritage last summer named 8 of Wright's works. If he were alive, he'd demand a recount, wouldn't he? Only 8. There's a beautiful little bookstore in Spring Green, Wisconsin, which is where Taliesin is. And a man came up to me, and he introduced himself from Madagascar. And in a beautiful, elegant accent, he said, Professor Hendrickson. I said, no, please call me Mr. Hendrickson. He said, I would like to ask you a question. He said, what is the most important thing you learned in this long journey about? Now, do you remember when we were in 4th grade and the teachers were trying to tell us what a periodic sentence is? A periodic sentence is backloaded. You have to know, you have to stick with the sentence until the last word. So when he said, Mr. Hendrickson, what is the most important thing you learned in this long journey about? I was absolutely certain that the next 3 words were going to be Frank Lloyd Wright. They weren't. He said, about yourself.
Oh.
And I took in a breath, and I said, well, I guess I learned once more about my humility, which gets back, or the need for humility, to you can never, ever get to the end of the knowing. That trip to Spring Green, Wisconsin, which was the first of things we did all fall and now and still going on, these were all put together by the wonderful Emily Reardon of Knopf, who's here in the front audience. I want to do a shout out to her. She's the great, great publicist of Knopf. And among other things, handles Robert Caro's publicity. So if I'm in the same league with her, just to be mentioned in the same breath. But you can never get to the end of the knowing. Kai, maybe that's what I learned most about this book. A teacup. a teacup. And this book is 600 pages. It's 200,000 words. It's a teacup of what I know.
A little teacup with a few tangents here and there.
No, no.
And one of the tangents that I particularly am intrigued by, there are two I want to talk to you about before the evening ends, is one is about Frank Lloyd Wright's first cousin, a man named Richard Lloyd Jones. And you go off on this tangent about the Tulsa race riot of 1921. And it's fascinating, but it is a tangent.
What in the hell? What in the hell is a book about Frank Lloyd Wright, a purported biography, doing with a 20,000-word chapter about the wrongly named Tulsa race riot? It's the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. The first sentence of that is, "We are speaking now of the Tulsa race riot of 1921. Yes, something that sounds absurdly far afield and isn't." Boy, you know, we mentioned this other event, August 15th, 1914, this horrific event in which a black servant set fire. Inexplicably, we don't know why that happened. That was August 15th, 1914. Roasted Taliesin to cinders. 7 people died, including some children who weren't Wright's children, or at least they were young people. Kai has opened this huge trunk. I opened it, didn't I, with the Tulsa Race Massacre. It was baited into being by Frank Lloyd Wright's first cousin, a man named Richard Lloyd Jones. If all I were trying to do was suggest some kind of guilt by association, wrong, shame on me, not worth doing, no, that's illegitimate. I was trying to explore, however successfully or getting back to these morality questions. What Frank Lloyd Wright felt about all that, because you see his first cousin, Richard Lloyd Jones, baited the Tulsa race riot into being because he was the newspaper publisher in Tulsa and fanned it into happening. But 7 years earlier, he was the editor of the Madison newspaper, Madison, Wisconsin, the Wisconsin State Journal, and saw what happened at Taliesin when a black servant named Julian Carleton inexplicably did this thing. Instead of serving lunch in his white serving tunic, began pouring the ropes of gasoline under the door jambs, and with a shingling hatchet held down at his side. Can you imagine the labor-intensive work of killing 7 people who are all trying to fight their way out of flames and smoke and fire? This man, Julian Carleton, never weighed more than 135 pounds in his life, and you'll forgive the tangent. One thing no one ever did in all the hundreds of books that have been written about Frank Lloyd Wright, there are at least 8 or 9 conventional biographies. This certainly is not one. This is not conventional. But in all these previous biographies, they all say Julian Carleton, a black servant from Barbados, yesterday. He wasn't from Barbados. He was from our own country. He was from backwoods Alabama. I went to Alabama. So we're talking the journalistic thing. Shirley Povich, who was the great sports writer, sports editor of the Washington Post. He worked at the Washington Post, where I worked proudly for 23 years. Shirley Povich he was the editor of the sports section. He worked 75 years at the Post. That's not a typo, because he lived deep into his 90s. He used to tell his young hires, I wasn't one of them, but I know that he used to say this: if you go, it'll happen. So in looking at Julian Carleton's death certificate, buried away in a drawer in Wisconsin, I saw in the lightest pencil the word Alabama with the question mark. And that drove me to Alabama. And that drove me to discover that Julian Carleton, the slayer of Taliesin, was never, ever from Barbados. And why is that important? That refracted back on a lot of the mysteries of Frank Lloyd Wright. I can't go into all of them now, but looping around on Richard Lloyd Jones, he was the editor of the Wisconsin State Journal in 1914 when this black servant, the first words in the Chicago Tribune the next morning, blaring across 7 headlines of type, "A Barbados Negro yesterday with a hand axe." And for all these books, if you go home tonight, don't take my word for it. If you go home tonight or right now on your phone, Google Julian Carleton, the first thing that'll come up will be Slayer, Barbados, Frank Lloyd Wright. No, he was never from Barbados. He was never from the Caribbean. I wanted to understand his life. So Richard Lloyd Jones had compartmentalized in a Manichaean way the good Negro and the bad inward. And while he was in Wisconsin, in liberal Madison, this compartmentalization, this Manichaean view of the world of good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, began to play in his mind. When he gets down to Tulsa 7 years later in a racist society, it wasn't anything for him to fan the flames of racial bigotry. And when a black shoeshine boy supposedly says something vile to a young white elevator operator, for him to splash that on the front page and perhaps write an incendiary editorial, which was disappeared from history. Nobody's ever been able to find that. So how does this relate to Frank Lloyd Wright? I wanted to know, in this secret man of these quotes that I was reading to you, what effect. So that whole section of the book is called The Chain of Moral Consequences. I was wondering, and it's the impossible answer. It's impossible to answer. But does 1909, which is the year he abandons his family and runs away to Europe with Mama, who was the first one slaughtered at Taliesin, leaving his 6 children in Oak Park, Illinois. She left her family. Does 1909, in some way, the chain of moral consequences lead to 1914? And in some way, does 1914 lead to or even need to be avenged by what happens in Tulsa in 1921? And there's a whole lot more, because we haven't even spoken of this, but the largest lie Frank Lloyd Wright ever told in a whole lifetime of lies was about his father. Frank Lloyd Wright insinuated, so that the whole world got the idea, starting in that autobiography, that his father abandoned the family in an 1885 family breakup when Wright was about to turn 18 and left them spiritually and financially bereft. The truth was exactly otherwise. It was Wright's mother who drove him out. It was Wright's mother who was the defendant. And as an old man, is Frank Lloyd Wright looking back, however surreptitiously, and pondering these moral questions. Why is it that Frank Lloyd Wright, as an old man who can no longer drive a car, is making semi-furtive visits to his father's gravestone in remote rural Wisconsin? The chain of moral consequences was something I was deeply trying to explore, and which I feel I'm being horribly inadequate at explaining to you.
Paul, you've just answered the question I was about to ask about Frank Lloyd Wright's father and the lies he told about him.
He was a failed man.
And you say at one point, dealing with Wright and the truth is like trying to hold mercury in your fist.
It is like trying to hold mercury in your fist.
So that seems to be both the theme of this book and the struggle and the mystery.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, I guess, maybe.
So I didn't come to Kai's incredible book on Robert Oppenheimer, Tabula Rasa. I'm an Oppenheimer guy. I love Oppenheimer because he's such a Renaissance guy. He could quote Sanskrit. He had such polar opposites from atomic energy, and But isn't it trying to get Oppie? Isn't it holding mercury in your fist? When he goes before those atomic energy hearings and he loses his clearance, it's all so vague and ambivalent. How do you sort out the truth of that?
It was hard. It took 25 years. And we still don't know. And so that theme of not knowing is, and the humility of realizing as the biographer that you cannot fully know is one of the reasons why I like this book so much. Listen, on that note, I want to open up to questions from the audience, if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And thank you.
We've covered, I think, some of the highlights of the book, but we've left a lot unsaid. There are microphones on both sides of the room.
Thank you. How did Robert McNamara find you as a subject?
I'm sorry, I missed my fading years.
How did McNamara find you to be a subject?
I can answer that fairly specifically. I wrote a series about McNamara in the Washington Post, a 3-part series in the spring of 1984. I was a staff writer in the feature sections of the Post. Nobody had ever gotten him to talk about Vietnam. In that long 3-part series, which blasted across the page for 3 days running, and sort of in its own way went viral before we had an internet, he didn't talk about Vietnam, but he talked hauntingly enough around Vietnam. Your question is this: 4 months before that, I wonder if you will recall, around Thanksgiving of 1983, there was a huge television event, a movie called The Day After. It's about the nuclear holocaust, the white winter after a nuclear attack. The panel lights come on after that movie, and all these American luminaries are in the audience in a panel. Henry Kissinger's so full of himself, and a whole bunch of others. McNamara was there, and I was riveted to him. I said, wow, that's Mr. Vietnam. In that panel, when the lights came on after that movie, do you remember that movie, The Day After? It really, was a kind of cover of Time magazine event. I thought McNamara spoke more modestly and more hauntingly than any of the other people on the panel. And I said, that guy, there's a humanity there in Mr. Evil incarnate of the Vietnam War, the architect of the Vietnam War. There's also something else there. So he got me in that show. And I went in the next day and I said to my editor at the style section, Mary Hadar, I said, did you see that last night? And I said, do you think McNamara would talk to us? She said, Paul, it's really hard. He's the best friend of Katharine Graham. He even dates Katharine Graham now and then. And he's on the board of the Washington Post. She said, but let's try. So I tried. And I wrote him a letter, no answer. I approached him again, no answer. Weeks went by. One morning, about 7:45, because the guy always got up at 5 a.m., I'm scraping myself out of bed, and this is Robert McNamara. So he calls me at home. And he said, listen, I'm not interested in doing any interviews for the Washington Post, much less for the style section, which I don't respect, but come over next Thursday at 4:45 anyway. So right away, the conflicted man. I'm sorry, another question.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have to jump in here. That was exactly what happened with me with regard to McGeorge Bundy. I heard McBundy give a speech in college, and I said, that man is a war criminal.
Absolutely.
An architect of the war in Vietnam. And yet here he is in my university, and he's clearly quite sophisticated and liberal and articulate, and I couldn't understand. I couldn't match the two, so he captured me then. And years later, I had to write his biography.
Exactly, and that and Kai's biography of the McBundy brothers, William and McGeorge. I never got to talk to McGeorge about Mcnamara because he was dead by then, but I went to Princeton and spoke to Bill Bundy. These strange things have a way of seizing us in ways we're not prepared for. I believe that our antennae are up, and we sense things, and we don't know, how to follow them out, but we feel we have to follow them out. On another note of humility, that Mcnamara book, it's 4 books ago. Again, Kai wins the awards, I become a finalist for them. That book was a finalist for the National Book Award. It was published in 1996, called The Living and the Dead, Robert McNamara and 5 Lives of a Lost War. The only way I could get that book done, and it took 12 years, because I gave it up. And I went back to the Washington Post with my tail between my legs, talking about all you don't know and your humility. I couldn't do the book, and I owed the publisher the money. I had spent up $75,000 of the advance. You take a leave of absence from the Washington Post on the idea that the book is going to happen. The Post took me back. I reclaimed my family's broken finances. I wrote another book in between, and finally, I approached the book again. My beloved editor at CUNY, he's not here tonight. He wanted to be of 40 years. He helped me come around to the idea, Paul, you're not Robert Caro, you're not David Halberstam, you're not Kai Bird. You are you, and you can do something. So I said, well, wait a minute. And then we began plotting it out. And the idea that came to me is, wait a minute, wonder if I put Mcnamara in the center of a wheel of sorrow and pain and war criminality, in quotes, and bring in, like spokes to the hub of that wheel, 5 other lives who were affected by his policies. That's how that book got done. I spoke to my son, John Hendrickson. He's here tonight. He's a senior editor at Politics. He spoke to my class at Penn last week about this landmark article he wrote this fall about Joe Biden and his stuttering for the Atlantic. But I said to and John's own speech difficulties, I said when I introduced John last week at Penn, I said, when I first started riding the train up one day a week as an adjunct at Penn in 1998, and keeping my seat at the Washington Post. John was 10 years old and in 4th grade at Miss Sampson's at Holy Trinity Elementary in Georgetown. And now here he is at 2020, and it's 22 years later, and I have the privilege of introducing him tonight. When that book began, the Mcnamara book began in 1984, John wasn't born yet. And when it was published in 1996, 12 years had gone by, so John is 8. In 1996, we had a big party at Chapter's bookstore in Washington, D.C. I'm signing books, and John whispers in my ear, Dad, what time is it? And I said, I don't know. I'm signing books, and I said, oh, it's 10 after 7. He said, darn it, I missed The Simpsons. It's true, isn't it? That's on video somewhere. You could look that up. Another question. I've stunned you into silence with my verbosity.
Hopefully this is an easy one. Was he born Frank Lloyd Wright, or did he change his name, and did that have any effect on his life, or do you have any thoughts on that?
He was born Frank Lincoln Wright by his father, named by his father. Yeah, we barely got into his father, and I'll leave that alone. His father was a minister, a music man, and after this 1885 divorce, wandered through America for the last 19 years of his life, and basically spiraled downward. And Wright knew it, and Wright was haunted by it. And Wright realized that the lie he had told to the world would be picked up by a whole first generation and second generation of biographers, which it was. So I write 2 long chapters called The Sad Ballad of William Carey Wright. That's Wright's father's name. He was born Frank Lincoln Wright. So many people born in the years immediately after the Civil War were named for the great slain Abraham Lincoln. He changed his middle name to Lloyd because that's the name of his mother's side of the family, the Lloyd Joneses, and he began to identify with them. But, the little man wanted a distinctive name. You can find through the tracings of his architectural renderings when at first he's signing his name Frank L. Wright, Frank Wright, and then it becomes Frank Lloyd Wright in 1896. And this kind of is a signal to the world that he was just on the cusp of his world fame at the moment that he became Frank Lloyd Wright. When we think of other architects, you think of Frank Gehry and some other people. But doesn't Frank Lloyd Wright sort of transcend architecture? He entered American myth. He's kind of like Elvis or like Hemingway. And one of the things I wanted to try to get behind was who really was this person who seemed to sail through the world with this stainless steel armature of ego and arrogance. Did you all ever hear the name Vincent Scully? So I am anything but an architectural historian or architectural. What I am is a narrative nonfiction writer who gets obsessively hooked into these projects and goes. But Vincent Scully, who's deceased, taught for decades and decades at Yale, just a beacon. He said once about Frank Lloyd Wright, and I have to respectfully and with humility totally disagree. This is germane to everything we've talked about tonight. So the late teacher critic Vincent Scully of Yale, whom I am in awe of both as a historian and writer, once said lyrically, quote, "I think of him always as the great American confidence man who is changing the world according to his own images, who's wearing disguises all the time. He's right out of Mark Twain. He's right out of Melville. He's the man, in his rebuilt Lincoln Continental, in which he has taken out the rear window because he says, 'I never look back.'" I respectfully say, all peace to you, Professor Scully, that he was always looking back, however surreptitiously. That's a long-winded answer to your question, sir.
Thank you.
Hi. One of the great mantras of journalism is that word objectivity. That when you're first learning journalism, it's drummed into you until you realize it's fantasy, it's a goal, it's something we're going after rather than a reality. But it's the idea that we are impartial observers, that we are standing back, observing and reporting. So part of what comes from that is the idea that you write in third person. You exterior description, third person narrative. Your interviews are in third person. More and more, first your decision to go ahead in first person. And then your thoughts about the whole trend now to first-person narrative in multiple forms in journalism?
That is such a beautiful question. Thank you, sir. And I don't think I can do justice to it. But yes, the traditional, conventional, journalistic voice is third person. the writer's point of view, if you're listening carefully, bleeds up through that third person, but it is still objectively told. I began to wonder. Kai and I had these beautiful email exchanges. I hope it's just not ego and hubris that I wanted to, in some sense, make myself a character on the page in terms of searching and discovery and letting the reader understand all that I don't know, taking the reader along with me so that it becomes, in some sense, a meta exercise. I believe that narrative nonfiction can have many, especially as it's being practiced now, many guises and forms, and that if you can control it, and I'm not saying that I have by any stretch figured out how to do it, but you can use first person in a guarded way and make the story richer. But my editor, John Siegel, who's not here, 3-4 books ago, yes, for this one I did win for a book called Sons of Mississippi. It won the National Book Critics Circle Award. It's about a photograph. The whole book derives from a photograph of 7 sheriffs in Mississippi doing a very ugly, scary thing, dressed up as if they're going to church with suits and ties, holding the baseball bat, trying to keep James Meredith from integrating Lily White, Ole Miss, 1963. I was entering myself into that story, and at one point I'm in Mississippi. The book is being written in various drafts and being sent to my editor, and I was in the archives at Ole Miss, and I saw that I had a phone call from John, and I went out on the deck of Ole Miss. I can picture this to this moment, and he said, "There's too goddamn much of you in the story. Start taking it out here and here and here and here and here." So I did. And it eventually got published. But it's a very important question. Okay, back to Bird. He's the conventional biographer. He's done John J. McCloy, the Bundy brothers, this 25-year co-authored project on Oppenheimer. But he tried it, and I think it's beautiful. He melded, he blended memoir and history in
Crossing Mundelbaum Gate.
Tell them about that book.
Well, it's the only time I've tried to write like you with the first person. I wish I could write more like you. But I tackled a childhood memoir about the Middle East, where I grew up as a child. And I was trying specifically to meld my childhood memories with my parents' correspondence, but trying to figure out all the history that I couldn't understand when I was a kid. All the wars, the 56 October War, the June 67 War, the October War of 73, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I had to use the first
You had
person.
no choice.
I had no choice, yeah. But it was difficult. It was but I had fun with it.
So David Marinus, whom I've mentioned, he's a great journalist, biographer, colleague from the Washington Post. He laps me on the track. He's written 12, I've written 6 or 7, depending on how you count. But his latest book, published last spring, A Good American Family. His father was in the party.
The Communist Party.
The Communist Party. And he had no choice but to write that first person. It was agonizing for him. I contend it's his best book. Yes, you had no choice. And did your editor hold your feet to the fire and say, Kai, if you're in for a dime, in for a dollar? I've heard Bob Woodward at the Washington Post say that. If you're going to go there, you got to go there. You have to do it.
I had to do that book. My editor...
Did he say you have to become a character on the page?
My editor understood that I had to become a character, yes, because it was a memoir. But it was on a difficult subject, a subject that's in the newspapers, oddly enough, almost every day. The Arab-Israeli conflict, the sort of troubled neighborhood, the Middle East, and yet it's a book that is trying to explain that, and yet people don't want to read a long book about the troubled neighborhood that they read about in the papers every day, because they know it's a horrible subject.
After you finished that book and had experimented, this wasn't the only time you've ever, I mean, in your journalism, you've written in some first-person stuff. Did you feel a particular sense of accomplishment that you didn't in the other books, no matter what it sold or didn't sold? Am I right that too was a finalist for the Book Critics Circle?
It was, and lost.
I have many more losses than you have.
But
Did you feel?
you're right. I felt liberated by using the
I was
first
going to
person.
I was going to use the word liberated.
I felt liberated. It was, and I still, am very proud of that book, even though it lost my publisher a lot of money. It didn't sell very well.
And this book has been a commercial and critical disappointment, and that's the truth. And I've been with the same editor for 40 years. It doesn't, in a sense, matter a damn to him. He's saying, of course, on the business ledger, it matters a damn. But he is saying to me constantly, we got to get on with the next one, Paul. We got to get on with the next one. You want to know what the next one is.
We do.
We're out of time, aren't we?
Well, we are running late, but you raised
No,
it. What is your next one? I'm intensely curious.
I don't know if I can do it.
We never know if we can
never
do it.
know, and there may not be enough fuel in the tank, and the bones are old. But for 40 or 50 years, literally. So I'm a slow learner, Frank Lloyd Wright, the boy on the maroon bicycle. My father flew a P-61 Black Widow on Iwo Jima, 75 combat missions.
Whoa.
He was a Kentucky farm boy, literally a sharecropper's son. And I've been collecting those stories. He's long deceased. And I went to the Night Fighter conventions with him, and a difficult man, a difficult marriage, and he had a huge career in commercial aviation. But I wonder if I can go back. It's the Greatest Generation Redux. Go back to those 8 years when he enlists in 1937 and comes out at 1945, home from Iwo Jima. And my mother, waiting out the war with 2 babies on her hip, one of whom was me, born in 1944. She's 21. When the last kiss goodbye was, he was 25 and she was 21, and they had 2 babies and they never knew if they'd see each other. It's about that, but it's about the men in his squadron and what became of their lives, the best years of their lives. I don't know if I can do that.
Oh, you have to do that. On that note, we'll let you go. Thank you.